Welcome to our official Indicators of a Thriving Workplace 2024 report. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're all joining from today. I'd like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders joining us today and also acknowledge the sovereignty that has never been ceded. Feel free to also put in the chat the name of the lands you are joining us from. Also, a note that we will have about 10 minutes for questions at the end, and some of our research and advisory colleagues, Di and Steph, are going to be in the chat to answer any questions that might arise as we go along, and this will save, and we'll also save some for the end. So feel free to put the questions in. This session is being recorded, and a link to this recording will be provided in our follow-up email. Also, if you'd like to quickly download the report before we start our discussion, and I think the girls are going to put a link in the chat to be available now. And so this is a great one just to have open as we chat along, Ross, isn't it? So before we start, and given the length of this webinar and the detail outlined in the report, this session will be top line. So once you take the time to read the report, there's some incredibly important data in there across all industries, and we are also available at the end of this to deep dive certain other industries that may not have been reported in this report. But I'm really thrilled, and I think that you are, Ross, as well, and the whole team at SuperFriend, to share with the audience today some of our most recent indicators of a thriving workplace. For those who's not familiar with the ITW, it's the nation's largest survey on worker mental health. It's been running now for over 11 years, so there's a wealth of evidence and context behind how we approach this survey. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's introduce Ross, Associate Professor Ross Isles. So Ross is the Chief Research Officer at SuperFriend and is driven to have a positive impact on the health and well-being of as many people as possible. This started off in a direct fashion working in physiotherapy practice and then moved on to research focus where people are ill or injured and unable to work. So after years working on ways to support people after a work-related injury, he's now dedicated to developing the evidence around preventing work on having a negative impact on mental health. He is determined to give employers the information they need to help their employees thrive at work. And for those who don't know, Ross is also my neighbour, so I do drive him mad 24/7. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you very much, Nat.
Yeah, a quick note to say that we did do that deep dive a couple of weeks ago into our 5 domains framework. So for anyone wanting the technical understanding about our framework, please review that. That is actually on our website that can be there for downloading. When you registered for this webinar, you may have seen the option, to put some of those questions in ahead of time. So thank you for those that did that. A lot of those questions will be called out today, so we've actually integrated that within our report. But there was one question we were going to touch on before we even get into our overall report, and that question is, Ross, what are the 3 key things that you think that we can learn from the latest data that SuperFriend's collected?
Thanks, Nat. I think the first thing that I need to say is that it's actually really hard to get across the amount of information that we've collected. So take our 5 domains framework that we spent a lot of time talking through at the last webinar that you mentioned. It's a great way to think about mental health in the workplace. We've got 5 domains for 19 industries that we measured at 4 different points throughout the year. So that's, some quick maths, that's 380 different numbers that you need to wrap your head around. And that's before we even start talking about psychosocial hazards. SuperFriend, we normally talk about 9. We actually have the data to be able to report on all 17 that have appeared in the latest set of codes of workplace codes of practice. Multiply that by the number of industries and by 4 times, you're actually talking over 1,000 different numbers. But that's just talking domains and psychosocial hazards across the industries at 4 different points. So what we've actually really tried to do in the report is sort of give people an idea of the information that we have for each of the industries that we have. We've described it for 6 key industries, and we'll go through which industries they are in a moment, just as an example of what we've collected. But even what appears in the report is still only a sample of some of the information that we have. But you asked me to give you three key messages, and so I'll make sure I do that. I think it's really important to identify that workers say that stress actually peaks in June and in December. And it's kind of one of those things that it's intuitive. We know there are busy times of year, just normal busy times of year. That's normal patterns of work. And what we actually see is people report stress spikes at different points of the year. Maybe it's because there's mid-year reviews or it's end-of-year demands. What's really important is that we can actually quantify some of that now. So we know when those busy spells are coming, what is the impact and how big is that impact? And I'm sure we'll touch on that in a bit more detail a little bit later too. That was point number one, that we see these peaks in what people perceive as these are our busy times, and it's kind of a normal stressful time at work. The second sort of key point is that based on our measurement tools that actually aim to capture burnout, negative workplace events, bad things that happen at work, and psychological distress using a clinical measurement tool, we actually see that rates of these negative aspects are higher at the end of the year than they are at the start. So there's almost like an accumulation effect that we see. And that's important for us to be thinking about if we're trying to look after people thriving at work, that there is these things end up accumulating throughout the year. I think intuitively that makes a little bit of sense too. I certainly know in my work, it kind of feels like the end of the year is the finish line, and then there's a bit of a reset period. But we know that's not the same for all industries. So we need to think about how different industries would deal with that. Which leads into the third point, which is really being proactive and thinking about mental health and thriving in the workplace in a proactive fashion. So being prepared for the peak times, knowing where they are for your industry, and actually acting in preparation for those. But also then thinking, well, when do you have the capacity to act? If you know it's a busy, stressful time for your workplace, that's not the time to be introducing something new. Preferably, you've actually have taken proactive steps. You're not introducing something when everybody's busy. People know what supports are available and when they're available and how to access them before the busy periods hit.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Ross. So tell me a little bit more about what's different this year, and also then what's inspired us to kind of change the report around a little bit more.
Yeah, so the key difference this year, I mean, we've always been updating our survey as we go with different questions, different elements. But this year was a big step forward, that instead of just doing the survey at a single point in the year and capturing a whole bunch of workers at one point, we actually conducted 4 rounds of data collection. So in March, June, September, and December, we're referring to those as effectively seasonal data collection. And each wave of data collection, just like we have in the past, was representative of industry, gender, age, and state. So we actually make sure we capture the right proportions of people, and how we do the analysis sort of takes care of making sure things are representative. But even in those 4 waves, the smallest of those waves was actually a little bit over 3,000 workers. The largest was just over 4,000. You put it all together, and so what this report represents is a little bit over 13,000 workers in terms of, and can tell us what's happening over the year. And that was the aim, because we know that things change throughout the year. That's what it feels like. And so just doing a survey at one point in time doesn't necessarily capture that. And so, like I mentioned before, we know there are those busy times. And so we actually ask people, when are the busy times for your, or where you feel stress and pressure at work? And so we were able to quantify some of those things and start to put some of the evidence behind actually preparing workers for the busiest times of year. So, put some numbers behind, what people, think and feel when it comes to their work life. Now, we've also captured a whole host of factors that there just wasn't enough space to put into the report. I'll get some examples. We've asked about life transitions that people are dealing with, whether that be planning for retirement, family crisis, care responsibilities, things like menopause. All of these things we know impact mental health, and they'll impact work as well. We have information related to people who identify as being neurodiverse. We've asked about managers' response if people have disclosed that they have a mental health condition at work. And so we've got some really interesting data that can actually help guide people to give them, what are the best responses to help people in the workplace when different things come up.
Yeah, fabulous. And that is so important, like looking at those ad hoc on how they then relate across the framework, and then also then maybe even how they differ for different cohorts across the years when you put that against the reported stress and performance pressure of the wave of seasonal data. So it's a really interesting point that, you know, we're starting to split into different cohorts and be able to start to become, you know, around having some great data to be able to provide really bespoke interventions, not only for certain industries, but also for certain cohorts within those industries across certain parts of the seasons. Love it. So let's talk about the actual domains, and we'll go into our own framework. What did we see across these in 2024? So we had a question coming up during registration around connectedness, specifically asking about the role and the significance of this. So maybe let's touch on connectedness as our domain, or one of our domains.
Sure. Well, I'll just give people a quick reminder what our 5 domains are. So one is connectedness, which is really about the quality of interpersonal relationships at work. We have the safety domain, which is really focused on preventing harassment, bullying, discrimination, and violence. We have a leadership domain, which is all really about how managers support people to achieve their organisational goals, but also how they demonstrate that they look after their own mental health as well. We have work design, which is really about how roles are organised at work and the level of authority people have in some of the decisions that affect them at work. And capability is about the skills and resources to support mental health. Our approach to our domains is we give each domain a score out of 100. 100 is the best it possibly could be. So you want a higher score when it comes to the domains. Now, when we're talking about connectedness, when we actually put all the 19 industries together, connectedness actually stays really quite consistent throughout the 4 measurement points that we took throughout the year. And this is actually pretty common when you have lots of divisions in a big data set, that if you put everything together, sometimes you can miss some of the really important information or some of the gold, if you like. And when we actually pull things apart and break it down into industries, that's where we actually start to see some differences. So, and these differences are in the report. So if you've had a look through the report, you can see what they are across some of those industries. But just as an example, public administration and safety actually have a peak in June, and then it tails off for the rest of the year in terms of connectedness. So whether that's related to some mid-year reviews or activities, just means people actually feel, you know, that their relationships at work seem to be better at that time of year, but it then tails off. In construction, their highest score happens in September. A different time of year for construction. But in healthcare, it actually stays rock steady throughout the year and is really quite high. It's one of the strengths of healthcare. So with connectedness in particular, we actually see some of the variations happen by industry. And that's where I guess the real gold or the most important aspect of this information lies, is to be able to work out, well, for our industry, what do we need to do? So in construction, you don't need to focus on connectedness activities in September, because that's when things are going well. It might be other times of year that you might need to maintain that sense of connectedness so it doesn't drop off at other periods. Yeah, the next domain I'll talk about briefly is capability.
Yeah.
Now, capability is consistently the lowest scoring domain in the past few years. And capability is that real world ability to support mental health. And when we do put all the industries together, we do see some change. And I'll get to a special number that we've worked out in a second. But you see a little bit of, there's a better score in September compared to other periods of the year, putting everyone together. But again, when you start to pull industries apart, you see some real changes. And so, for example, in healthcare and education, it's actually not the lowest scoring domain. It's the work design challenges in these industries that score lower than the ability to support mental health. And that's probably because we know that in healthcare and education, there are certain things about the job that you can't change too much in terms of work flexibility and some of the decisions that you make. So there's been, I guess, a focus on providing some of the supports for people in those roles. So you see that there are different challenges and different priorities in the industries, and not only by industry, but also depending on the time of year. The next thing, because we have so many of these data points in the report, we wanted to work out what's the best way to help people interpret with so many numbers. How do you know if the score's going up or down, and has it gone up or down enough for it actually to be particularly important? So we've crunched some data in the background, and if people have technical questions, absolutely happy to answer them. But I don't want to don't want to dive into that detail today. But ultimately, the best number to remember is 2. So if you see a difference of 2 points or more in a domain score, you can be confident that there's actually been an increase or a decrease. And that's on average, across the domains, across our psychosocial hazard scores, which I'm sure we'll dive into a little bit later. That if you see a difference of 2 or more, you can actually be really confident that there's actually it is actually a higher score, not just a normal variation in terms of people answering the survey. So when you're looking through all the numbers in the report, keep an eye out for a difference of 2 or more. So I hope I've explained that clearly enough. And also in the report, we've spoken about 6 industries. We've given some detail about retail, agriculture, education, healthcare, construction, and public admin and safety. We had to choose some because to report on 19 it just gets overwhelming. If you're from those industries that appear in the report and want to know more, because we haven't given everything about every industry, the aim was to sort of show you this is some of the information that we found. Please get in touch with us because we have more detail. If you're not from those industries, it's not a case of all bad luck, too bad, you're not in an important industry. We've got all the information on those industries. All the information that you see in the report, we have exactly the same information for all of the other industries as well. But you just need to get in touch with us. Because one of the challenges when you have so much information is it's to make sure that you're hypothesis driven. Rather than just going looking for things in the information, ask us a question. We can find the answer for you, and it's the best way to use the data, the best way you possibly can.
It's a really good example that you've got, and healthcare and education. Obviously, it's very much always in the news. Especially around the occupational violence increase, and then even how that relates to intent to stay within the organ or within the industry. So, that's something else that we can talk to you about. It's like even how the domains, as you suggested before, the higher or the more consistent level of connectedness is more seen in industries that actually have a poorer work design. And the capability can also be, again, higher because we need to have those parameters in place for what the industry actually is, what occurs within that industry. And this is important for us to actually know. But then again, from a seasonal perspective, when there's certain peaks of reported stress, just to certainly have these protective factors put into place, and then some. So yes, exactly as Ross said, and hopefully we're going to be going into deep diving a lot of these industries across webinars, just so you can get a bit more of a broad brush on what's going on within your industry there. But look, I briefly touched then on psych hazards and occupational violence being a large one right now that we're seeing a lot within the media and within society, especially across those two, healthcare and education. But let's look at the seasonal differences from a psych hazard pattern that we might be seeing, and what are the links between these?
Well, I mean, to be honest, Nat, when it comes to psychosocial hazards, we've only touched on it relatively lightly in the report. And part of that is that there's just so many of them to report on that it can actually get really overwhelming. And like I mentioned, there are 17 psychosocial hazards in the National Code of Practice that was recently released. We have the data on all 17 of those psychosocial hazards in our data set. In the past, we've reported on 9 specific hazards alongside the domains, and they're actually really quite closely related to our domains. But I guess once again, it's worth recognising that the poorest performing hazard, and remember, high scores are good in our data set, is recognition. So recognition last year was the hazard people reported as the poorest, happened again this year as well. But what we were able to do, we're actually, what you'll see in the report is that we've picked 3 particular hazards. And what we find with these hazards, one of them is recognition. they followed a similar pattern. When in March and December, they actually achieved a similar score, but there was actually a peak. There's a clear peak in June, and then there was a steady decline from there until December. And I mean, what this says to me is it's important to know what happens in the middle, because if you're only looking at these hazards at those points in time, you think, okay, well, this is the situation. But knowing what happens in between, that there's a time of year where things actually improve. And what are some of the reasons why those things improve? Is it because, again, there's a mid-year review? Maybe it's linked with lots of maybe review cycles or end of financial year, whatever it is. There's some sort of cycle that means you actually pay a bit more attention to how things are going in the workplace. Or there's a feedback cycle that means you can actually respond to, oh, people are actually saying this is happening, so we actually need to respond to it so people feel heard, or whatever it might be. Knowing that there are peaks and troughs mean that you can actually respond appropriately. And so it means, mental health and managing psychosocial hazards, it's not a set and forget. And you can't just do it once a year or just address it in a single mid-year review. You need to have a continual view about what's happening and look to put in, I guess, sustainable strategies, not just a one-off thing that's actually going to say, okay, we've done that for this year, then we can get on with things. And this is really important for employers because they have a responsibility, a legal responsibility, to be addressing what's happening from a psychosocial hazard point of view, and to have a view of that psychosocial hazards are not a one-off thing throughout the year is, I think, an important way for employers to demonstrate that they are actually looking after their employers. But I think, I guess one of the hazards that's possibly the most close to my heart, I suppose, is workload. It's always an interesting thing to look at. We know when we feel like our workload is high, and there are times when it's not so high. But if we use the example of healthcare, we see a really sharp rise for workload in healthcare at the end of the year. And nearly half of the workers in healthcare are actually saying their workload is inappropriate when it comes to the end of the year. And when we dive into the data that we've got, again, we've got a little bit more than what we've put in the report, but there's some quotes in there that sort of explain it a little bit, is they're running on shorter staff because it's the time of year that people wanted to take holidays. And there's usually less admin support staff, or because it's that time of year that people want to take off, but the work doesn't stop. And so those who are working through that period actually say their workload is through the roof.
It's interesting as well,
yeah,
because from a societal perspective, and we know, again, from a mental health perspective, that there is a lot of presentations around December. We always believe that, the holidays coming up, or we've got the end of year, and that's how we get there. But we also then know from other data points that can be an extreme time of grief, and other mental health presentations. So that's just mental health. Physical health is another area. As we get tired and as we get more burnt out, we can be more prone in certain industries to actually have greater accidents. So you can see that the compounding effect of workplace in general, how that actually has on our healthcare industry.
Absolutely, and we see that through winter there is an increased workload for healthcare through that period as well, because that's cold and flu season, and so that means fewer people can go to work. There are shifts that need to be covered, but more people coming in the doors because they're unwell. So it's a bit of like a perfect storm almost for healthcare. So they're really facing some of those challenges both at the end of the year, but also in the middle of the year. But what's interesting is that we measure psychological distress using the Kessler-6 tool, and we'd expect to see that measurement tool some peaks and troughs, similar to what people are saying is stressed, and it is there. It's just not as pronounced as what people necessarily are feeling as that that busiest time. So it doesn't quite match those peaks. So perhaps they're, for some people, that it's actually like, oh, we can get through this busy time because there's a break not far away, and that might be enough to manage short term for them to be able to go, yeah, it's okay, it's a short period that I can put up with. But then there's these questions with relationship to burnout, because for retail, the highest reported period of burnout actually occurs in September, which is effectively before what you'd expect to be the busiest time of year. So there's that question of, is there a mental effort required if you're working in that sector to go, okay, we've got to brace for, we've got the busiest time coming, and that's where people are feeling burnt out because they know it's got, there's a storm coming perhaps.
Yeah. And
But
e-commerce, the way that we look at the way we shop now, like again, setting up the parameters on certain, with a lot of e-commerce that requires a lot of work to have, capability of your own systems to be put in place. And that's going to also affect your workload because those systems are going to be very much put in place before the Christmas period starts.
yeah, absolutely. I'm not a psychologist, Nat, but I guess I'm making some guesses as to why when we see some of these different things in the data, where you see rates of burnout higher before busy periods, I guess there's that challenging separation between the work pressures, but then also the home pressures, and those things don't separate easily. At least they don't in my life. I'm not sure about for other people as well, but that it combines together. And we really need to be aware of that in workplaces because, like I said, employers actually have a responsibility to look after their employees.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The internal and the external factors do play a part, and everyone brings their whole self to work. We can't just bring only half. And I think as well, this is an indicator, isn't it, Ross? Like these are indicators, but it's here just to get you thinking about how your workplace actually functions around that time. So your workplace could actually perform well, but if you don't know where the peaks and troughs are, you can't actually then go in to investigate, does this actually affect my team? And does this warrant any further investigation?
I did see very briefly, I saw one of the comments pop up in terms of people saying that people are actually supporting each other in that period. The busy period's coming. So perhaps in retail, it's like, okay, now's the time when we band together and we support each other in workplace, which is just another example of why connectedness is such an important factor to consider in the workplace.
And you also think if our connectedness is our driver, that actually brings down psychological distress.
That's right.
Yeah, so that will be what keeps it at bay. And psychological distress is, for those who don't know in the audience, it's actually made up of anxiety and depression. So when we can actually look at a moderate level of anxiety and depressive symptoms, or it could be more one than the other, when you actually have a high level of connectedness within the organization, to be able to sit there and to talk about it and to process that is what's going to be able to keep them at bay. But very interesting that we've got different rates of psychological distress and burnout across different parts of the season too. Okay, let's get us into the industries. So who is thriving, who isn't, which industries have we seen changes from in previous year? What page is that on the report, Ross? Just direct
page number 9 on the report has a clear graph of the industries. So I'll keep going, Nat. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
I think really the biggest and the most sustained improvement we've actually seen in the past few years is in construction. Construction now sits third on our leaderboard, if you like. And what we've seen, I guess, when you see an industry like construction continually improve in terms of how they're going, the question is why. And we can point to some factors, and it could be that there are programs like Mates in Construction, which are really focused on the collaboration of employers, unions, and stakeholders to really foster a culture of openness and support around mental health issues. Initially, it was in response to, I guess, high suicide rates, but basically it's an industry-wide approach that has been applied that's looking to, address some of the stigmas around mental health, particularly in a male-dominated industry. And so actions like developing a blueprint for action to strengthen mental health frameworks and suicide prevention efforts sector-wide, I think that has to be some element of what we see with construction improving in the rankings. I think my reflection is, in terms of perhaps with the exception of construction, the top 5 industries tend to be very similar, and the bottom 5 industries tend to be pretty similar. They might sort of shuffle places up and down, but generally they sort of retain their places. What we've seen with healthcare we've seen a further drop in its overall score in 2023, and it's still sitting there in the bottom 5. So it actually, we know there are significant challenges, and I think we hear on the news, etc., some things like there's a crisis in this industry. We know that burnout is an issue. We know occupational violence is an issue. So we actually have some real challenges when it comes to healthcare, and SuperFriend will be diving into that industry in a range of fronts to be able to provide more information to help support that industry with some of the challenges they're facing.
Okay, so let's before we pass it over to the audience, so what? So what is the so what here? This is something that, you and I work, well over and mull over. What does this all mean? Why is it important? And what should we do with it? What should we do with all this data, Ross?
It's a great question, Nat, because I mean, I think what we really need is we need people working in the industry, working to help, working in the different industries, working to help their employees thrive, who actually come and ask us the questions that they need. What do you need to know? And there's a very good chance that we have the information they need. Is it that we have a large Gen Z workforce, and so we want to know what are some of the issues facing that particular workforce, or in retail, what are some of the supports that we need to give, or is it what's the best way to train my managers to respond if someone tells them they're struggling with their mental health? What are some of the information that we need, or what do we need to be able to do? Or we know we have a number of our workforce identify as neurodivergent. What are some of the things we can do to support them to make sure that they have what they need in the workplace, because they're fantastic and valued employees? We have that level of information to inform workplaces, I guess, on an individual level, what to do. But then also thinking, well, from perhaps at the higher level, from a regulator point of view, what are some of the key challenges for a particular industry? Is it the leadership levels, or do we actually need to be providing extra resources as a peak body or as a regulator to actually improve or help people with work design, to give people more control over what it is that they're doing? Or if how can we support employers address a particular psychosocial hazard, and perhaps when do we need to be giving them that information? Do we need to have it ready for them at the start of the year? Or is it only likely that there's a certain time of year they'll actually be able to act on it? So we have that level of information to be able to guide those future steps. And I think knowing about the problem is important, but we're not going to sit around and just admire the problem and just keep looking at these components. It's actually having actionable insights that you can see. So if you know that leadership is low, or leadership drops off at the end of the year, you know what to do about it. It's actually then we need to upskill the leaders. We actually need to give them the supports they need to be able to identify mental health and respond. If safety is the issue, you know you need to take action when it comes to harassment and bullying in the workplace. That's where the SuperFriend 5 domains framework, I think, is really actionable, in terms of it's easy to follow, easy to understand, but then can actually give clear ideas in terms of what those next action steps would be. But now, like I said before, you're the psychologist. What are you seeing? What do you think is important if you were an employer or a regulator in those roles? What would you be making of this information?
Look, I think that the seasonal trends, and absolutely agree with you on the leadership impact on how you execute some of the interventions at the right time for the right industry is going to matter, because we're being able to then hone down into where we need to be able to provide the best focus that's going to create the best impact, rather than just having that one size fits all approach at a certain time of the year. We could be completely missing the mark. We know that workplaces, they don't operate on that, that fixed annual cycle, and our surveys now don't either. The stress, the workload, the engagement, it fluctuates. So the fact that we're able now to capture this and as that indicator is great, a great wealth of knowledge. But as you know, Ross, you're talking so much about the peak pressures, like what we can do to prepare. For me, it's about how we reflect after that. And, how did things go? What worked well? Where can we improve? What additional support you need? So bringing in that lived experience and getting together after that stressful period has you've gone back over the hump, is that is where the psychological and psychosocial safety can start to be created and formed. And this is where leadership plays a major part in this piece. And it's not about an operational exercise here. It's actually about a trust building opportunity. So when employees see that leaders are and listening and then adapting to what they're saying, that you will actually see that engagement and that motivation and that resilience across your workforce starting to increase. And this is where we can then come in and shine as well, because we can measure that. So we can actually show that this is a data-driven, your change is creating also a different measurement within the domains. So making reflection, once you've got the preparation as part of a structured workplace culture, that will then really start to create that safe environment. And this is again where you've also got the opportunity with reflection to address one of the psychosocial hazards that again we continually see come at the bottom, which is around recognition. And this is also going to be able to enhance our workplace capability. And so, to be able to have that opportunity to say, how we kind of came together as a team and rewarding that task, that project, that season, that time is really important. Also, just for certain divisions and even certain employees to hear, because that's going to then continually bring their motivation and also makes them feel part of the bigger picture. But, just to address some of those areas around capability, again, I don't want to sound this as a kind of negative thing, but, we're continually seeing from the 11th year that our capability domain, it still remains low, even after everything that we've done, on trying to enhance that level of, mental health resources within the workplace. We know that stigma is still there. We see this in the report. I'm not too sure which page it's on, Ross, but we've got a beautiful little infographic where it says, 40% of our employees that we were testing respondents, they cited confidentiality is still a concern as a barrier to accessing support within the workplace. And 23% were saying it wasn't actually convenient for them. And 17% are still have that fear that there is a repercussion if they disclose or if they go and seek mental health support. So what that is suggesting that there is still a level of stigma within the workplace. Now, another one of those lovely infographics, again, can't remember the page that it's on, Ross, but we've got a total of 55.8% are reporting moderate to severe levels of psychological distress. So that is a moderate to severe level of anxiety and depressive symptoms that are displayed in the workplace. And 45% were identifying with burnout. Now, where that's most concerning for me as a psychologist and the translator here is that only 11 to 12% of those experiencing the severe distress and burnout are actually seeking support through their workplace, with many preferring the external resources. So as we were talking before on the impact on healthcare, and as we see that the psychological distress and burnout rises throughout the year, and we then look at the impact in December on our healthcare, you can start to see that it's all kind of coming together, and that can actually create the perfect storm and compound one industry that's already quite vulnerable. So what can we do? So this is a great kind of answer: is how can we be able to mitigate or reduce that response that is impacting one of our most precious industries as well. And leadership is the driver of change. This is where our data shows that authenticity and along with the strong mental health awareness can be a driver to low burnout, higher productivity, and the greater intent to stay. So how do we shift, that workplace culture to reduce the stigma and also build out our capability around accessing support? So there's a lot of work around leadership, and as you know, that's a real passion of mine. And yes, look, before I think I'll sum up now, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to get told to. But what you said before is, we need to understand who is responsible for this. Is it more the organizations embedding it? Is it industry? Is it government to start driving some of these system changes, that we can speak to a unified framework such as the 5 domains like ours. So we can talk about this all day. And the report is just the tip of the iceberg, as we've alluded to. As I said before, there's also going to be more reports and wellness by the water coolers that Ross and I are going to chat into, which are going to be industry-led. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it over. If there's any questions, Ross, we've got a couple of minutes that anyone might, Steph, Di, anything that might come up that we can answer.
I do know that I can see in the chat, I put a little red number on the bottom of the screen saying there's 54 different things on the chart, in the chat.
Okay.
Trying to find how can we get to the ones we can answer now.
Okay, so we've got, let's have a look here. Pretty sure that I've been one through.
Okay, so there's a question here. So what are some of the other things you capture? You mentioned neurodiversity. So we capture neurodiversity. So in terms of the indicators of a thriving workplace survey, we ask more than 100 questions every time we do a wave of data collection. So I did see briefly, and there's a response in the chat as well. We do ask about occupation. We capture people's postcode, so there's an opportunity for us to actually show where people are in Australia. We actually see that at the end of the report, so we can one of my favourite pictures that we produce, because you can see the dots are all around Australia in terms of who's contributed to the survey. We ask a series of open-ended questions as well. So, an example that I mentioned before is we ask people if they have been diagnosed with a mental health condition and whether or not they've actually disclose that to their workplace, and then if they have, what was their manager's response? And so, watch this space. We'll have a very interesting report on the findings for that coming out. I'm just trying to think of all the things that we measure. It's difficult to get a hold of them all, but we do measure. We mentioned life transitions before in terms of identifying, some of the things that people are facing outside of work happening at the same time. But we also capture a range of work-related information. So we capture whether people, have predominantly physical or mental activities in their work, as well as their occupation and their industry that they're working in. We ask people to ask people to give us an idea of, things like their salary, so we can see if there's a difference between high earners, low earners. For example, we capture age information. We ask people if they're preparing for retirement. There's a whole range of information. And like I said, that's where we want people to come and ask us, what do you know about X? Because we have the information to dive into, and we just have so many that we've got so much that if we would prefer to be answering other people's questions, to serve what people need to know.
And I think that it's a good topic, and especially around the life transitions, and we've got some great stats around that, around planning for retirement, personal family crisis, the menopause, perimenopause, care responsibility, really interesting insights that have come out in that section. And from the neurodiversity perspective, the lovely Steph will be hosting the next Wellness by the Water Cooler around neurodiversity. So make sure that you do sign up for that. But I'm being told now to wrap it up, Ross. I hope you can also then take a moment. I think the girls are going to put in the chat to complete our survey about today's webinar. Obviously, we have plenty more webinars, and we love to hear back from you. It'll only take a few minutes, but thanks, Ross. Thanks for joining me today. And thanks everyone for coming. These findings in the report, they're really significant, not only across, workplace industries, organisations, but, just the wider stakeholders as well. And we really intend to share these far and wide. So, what we're all trying to do here is to create that thriving workplace and understand what the drivers are. Hope to see you in the next Wellness by the Water Cooler, and have a lovely day, everyone.
Look forward to it. Thanks all.